Hello, everyone. This is the Critical Adjunct channel, and I'd like to welcome you to the Critical Adjunct Discusses Systemic Racism, Part 2. I am the Critical Adjunct, and I am happy to discuss in this part some of my own personal maybe failings, and I realize and hope you do too, that I am in some way making myself vulnerable. But I think that's a risk worth taking because I think this is an important topic. In part one, I discussed my experience with systemic racism in the early 1960s. And in part two, I want to more thoroughly discuss unconscious bias that I believe all people have, no matter what their color or ethnicity or gender for that matter. And I will talk about my efforts to look deeply within myself to find my unconscious bias and make a significant effort to correct it. As was the case with systemic racism in part one, it's important, I think, to define bias in part two. And for that, I rely on Merriam-Webster, who defines bias as an inclination of temperament and outlook. I would argue that everyone is inclined towards certain temperaments and outlooks about, among other things, race, including black and brown-skinned people. In part one, I spoke about my experience with my Air Force friend who was prevented from entering a movie theater with two of his white friends. He and I were excited when we received orders to report to a base near Sacramento, California. And after spending the holidays at home with our families, he in Ohio and me in Pennsylvania, he and I reported, and we were assigned the same room. As roommates, we had some very interesting and intense discussions about race, but mostly about discrimination and how he experienced it and also how he feared it. The conversations were always open, honest, and respectful. And I learned a great deal about what it felt like for him to be discriminated against or to be potentially discriminated against, walking around with that burden on his shoulders. The question I think is important for all of us to ask ourselves is, how do we interact with one another? Do we ignore or make seem invisible others that don't look like us or sound like us? Do we say hello to people who look and sound like us when we pass them on the street, but not to those who don't look and sound like us? Do we say hello when someone that doesn't look like us enters an elevator we're on? Do we start a conversation with that person? Do we sneer, as some of my longtime friends do, when TV shows and movies start presenting black actors and actresses on the screen? Have you ever wondered what it felt like to watch TV shows and movies that you really liked, but seldom see anyone that looks like you? I have, and I will talk about it a little later. So if any of those questions apply to your behavior, I would ask, whether it's motivated by an inclination or of temperament or outlook. In other words, could it be motivated by some sort of bias that's buried within your unconscious that you're really not even aware of and won't be aware of unless you look deeply within yourself? So regarding black and brown actors we now see on TV commercials and shows and movies, I'd like to share an experience with you and an inclination and an outlook that I wondered about. Some years ago, going back into the 1980s, I was sitting in a hospital radiology waiting room waiting for an x-ray. I was the only white person in the room of about 8 to 12, I can't remember exactly, people. I was reading, most of them were watching TV, and I wondered what it felt like to seldom see someone on TV that looked like you. And so when later in the 20th century and now in the 21st, there began to be more black actors on the small and large screens, I was happy about that. However, and this will bear some vulnerability, when the scripts started to include mixed race couples, I began to feel uncomfortable. I didn't like that discomfort and chastised myself for allowing racist thoughts to creep into my mind until something happened that really surprised me. At first, the mixed race couples that were presented were mostly black men with white women, and that made me uncomfortable. Suddenly, mixed race couples with black women and white men started to appear, and almost shockingly, I realized there was no discomfort at all. And it really took me aback to the point that I started to question whether this original discomfort had anything to do with race. And after thinking about it a lot, I realized that it had more to do with dominance, fearing white women being lost to others not like me. Recognizing that literally cured the discomfort. Now, some might say, is that trading one inclination for another? And it probably is. I'm sure that the realization that I had comes as no surprise to many people, particularly perhaps women. But that's not my purpose at hand. My purpose is to understand that there was something inside of me. I didn't put it there. I don't know how it got there, but I let it creep into my behavior. So some may worry about systemic racism and bias more than individual bias and racism. They may say we have to solve the issue at the organizational or system level before we even think about the individual level. And my response to them is that if we don't solve it at the individual level, it'll never be fixed at the systems level. So, and I think that includes both sides of this equation. As I've maintained all along, I believe there's bias in everyone, no matter what your race, no matter what your ethnicity, no matter what your gender. So there are examples of that all around us. I'll share two that I think are important. This summer, we heard about a young woman who was deeply hurt because of what she thought was racist behavior on her college campus. She made the statement, "I was eating while black," and she was eating in a place where theoretically she wasn't supposed to be eating. And then we see Olympic athletes turning their back to the flag of the country they may represent at the Olympic Games this summer. I don't want to diminish how either of those women feel, but I suspect that neither one of them has been denied entry to a movie or had to enter a medical clinic through a separate door just for them. So one might ask why they feel they are living in a systemically racist country. Before I attempt to answer that question, I'll ask what is their inclination of temperament or outlook? Is it possible that they too are experiencing unconscious bias similar to my own, but for wholly different reasons? Has the overuse of terms like bias, Jim Crow, and systemic racism that we hear from the highest levels of our government, from the people that are supposed to be uniting us, has that seeped into their unconscious to a point where they see it lurking behind every interaction with people of a different skin color? Or is it possible they have felt the subtle discomfort that I felt, but for a wholly different reason? And so I will not deny that explicit racism and implicit bias exist, and they probably always will, sadly. Nevertheless, we have an obligation to respectfully call out the racist among us while doing everything we can to make our implicit bias conscious so we can do something about it. We cannot fix what we ignore or don't understand. Finally, some in our society have advanced the concept of white guilt to atone for the sins of America's past. And others seem to want to ignore that past. They say it was a different time, and I certainly agree. But we have to acknowledge our country's past and our own bias and resolve to continue to build on the racial successes that were achieved in the last 3.5 decades of the 20th century and continue throughout the first 2 decades of this century. We should not expect black and brown people to cower or apologize for their skin color, nor be made to feel guilty for being born black or brown. And at the same time, I do not want anyone to ask me to apologize for my skin color or attempt to make me feel guilty for being born white. We need to come together as one group of human beings and understand ourselves, our temperaments, and our outlooks better. And that's part 2 of the Critical Adjunct discusses systemic racism. There will be a part 3. I was very impressed with a Black Horse podcast where Bret Weinstein interviewed Brittany King, and I have some comments in response to their broadcast. I think that podcast was in early April of this year, you might want to check it out if you can. I hope you will continue to support the Critical Adjunct channel on both Rumble and YouTube. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate your time.